I'm Liam Spradlin with Touchlab. If you don't know Touchlab, we're an Android development and design shop in New York. We work on super cool projects like Link NYC, Research Stack. I'm lead designer there. I've had the pleasure of working on UIUX and visual design for apps like Nova Launcher, ClassPass, Today Calendar, AllCast, things like that. So today, we're going to talk about mutative design and specifically what it's like to use a mutative interface. So first, I just want to ask who all here has heard about mutative design or Project Phoebe? Okay, I got a few people, cool. I'll start off just first with a story. So a few months back, I met a woman who had MS, and her phone was a cordless phone, and she was having a lot of trouble pressing buttons because of limited physical acuity. So I write for Android Police, so I have a lot of extra phones lying around that don't really get used, and I thought about the Moto X, which you can activate with your voice. You don't have to touch the screen to activate it, so I thought it would be a perfect fit for what she needed. And it turned out that that was true, but pressing buttons and interfaces and sometimes seeing certain things was still a challenge. And I bring this up because it highlighted for me that, accessibility and design, making sure that everyone that can use your app or whatever experience you're building, is something that's too often either partially implemented or left behind. Because, designing for every point of accessibility can sometimes sacrifice other areas of the design, right? So fast forwarding a little bit, I was speaking with a developer friend in New York named Gaia. She was working on an app for children, which is a tough segment because, if you're covering the whole range from toddlers to older children, their expectations and needs and familiarity with tech changes a lot in that time. So we were talking about how she could design something that would be engaging for all of those users. And there's kind of like a little idea here of like, what if you could change something about the interface or the copy or just the strings or something as the child aged to keep them engaged in the program. And then I was talking on a podcast with Roman Nurek about launchers, and he told me a story about how his grandmother is not really familiar with launchers, and it's like, there are tough concepts there that people who aren't familiar with tech wouldn't necessarily know about. So we were talking about what if we could build launchers for every kind of specific person instead of building these like really large launchers for a mass audience. So all of these things kind of came together and turned into Project Phoebe, which is the first open source step toward mutative design. Mutative design basically is a theoretical kind of framework or way of thinking about design that would allow a UI and UX to be born and evolve with users' realities. So things like low vision, low physical acuity, low access to data, things like that are kind of like fundamental realities about how the user is using their device and how they're going to interact with apps. So it's a way of thinking about design, planning for automatic mutations to accommodate for those things. But even, hearing all of those stories, even so, why would we want to pursue something like this? Right now, I would say when it comes down to it, when we're designing experiences and interfaces, we're designing for averages, right? So you have data about the market that you're hoping to reach, the users that you expect to use your product, and even sometimes users that you don't expect to use your product. And then once you launch, you get more data and feedback, then you adjust accordingly. But that doesn't really solve the issue, right? Like that creates a problem of accessibility and just engagement for every single user, no matter what their situation is. So in that sense, just to answer the question on the slide, yes, I think this makes sense, obviously, since I'm here talking about it today. And you can read more about that at a link that I'll give later. But for now, we're just going to gloss through kind of the basics of mutative design methodology. So first, the most fundamental thing, when I was talking about user realities, so that's characteristics and extra characteristic states. So a characteristic would be something like low vision. That's just a fundamental reality about the user. Extra characteristic states would be something like changing light, data availability, things like that. So these are kind of the things that you consider the design reacting to. And then mother design is essentially like the archetypal design of what you're working on. It's something that the user might never see because that might mutate before they ever use it. But it's the starting point where some of your decisions are going to be made. And we'll talk more about that later. Starter states are essentially the first mutation of the app beyond the mother design is the starter state. So you account for as many of those characteristics as you can initially, and then continuous mutation after that to adapt to their changing realities. And so I'm sure everybody in the room has already thought about this, but there are some like very serious fundamental doubts about this, right? User confidence is probably one of the biggest ones. Basically, when a user uses your experience, they're forming a mental model about how it works. And they come to expect certain things. There are things like muscle memory, just object permanence, visual location of things, that could be at risk if you're moving things around with mutations all the time, right? The other problem is accounting for everything, which, if you're going to account for all these characteristics, we have to come to some terms on how that's even possible, and tough decisions like deciding to mutate. So how and when does the app/framework know to mutate something? And those, are addressed in the original story, but back to Selene. Experiencing mutations. Selene is a sample app that Francisco Franco and I published today. It's open source, and it's the first mutative sample app, as far as I know, ever. It has 2 mutations working right now that we're going to talk about. So the first one is ongoing, kind of like on-the-fly extra characteristic change, and that's the contrast mutation. The contrast mutation, basically, I'll show you, not a live demo, though you can see a live demo if you want to after the talk. Is this. So as you move into brighter lighting conditions, the note contrast will automatically increase according to how bright the light is, essentially. So then, we also need to talk about long-term changes, transitioning over time, and as I mentioned, disturbing user confidence. So ideally, you would get most of the changes out of the way in the first mutation, like I said, but it wouldn't be true to the spirit of mutative design if it weren't flexible enough to keep changing. So basically, don't pull the rug out from under the user all at once. I think my current idea about this, and it's an ongoing project, so this will probably change, but my current idea is striking a balance with the mother design, the first design that you do, deciding what elements establish that mental model and those muscle memory factors, and then sticking with those. Don't switch 2 buttons around just to promote a new feature, things like that. And then the other thing about Selene is Gaia, which is mutation kind of as a platform. So the concept behind Gaia is how can we, if as developers and designers we're deciding what mutations to support ourselves based on our instincts or data, then that's not really, solving the problem that we set out to solve. Because ultimately we're still designing for averages. It may be a more flexible version of what we're currently doing, but it isn't really true to the spirit of mutative design, so it needs to happen automatically. So the bright and magical future, which is like how I think Gaia could work in the future, would be a piece of the framework that basically is a broker for mutations and their success rates. So it would basically contain the instructions for different elements to mutate, and then it would give those instructions to the UI elements in each app, and then the apps would report back the success rates. So for instance, if the app found that a user was missing a touch target, a visual target, by a certain amount each time, then it's possible that we could adjust that to help them more successfully press that button. So if that mutation works, if the mutation is, say, like making the button bigger, if that works better, that's reported back to Gaia, and then Gaia gives other apps that information for that certain reality to, speed up successful mutations in the future. But that's not how it works right now because we don't have access to the kind of like low-level things that we would need to make that happen. So how it works in Selene is it's basically just a class with instructions on how to mutate. It tells, for instance, the elements that subscribe to it how they should, how their colors should change in response to light sensor values, and things like that. So any element that's then subscribed to it just follows those instructions. So designing for Gaia then presents a challenge because we're doing all this automatically, right? And so I'll walk through kind of how we did that with Selene and the contrast mutation. So first, the mother palette. This is the palette that I started out with. When I was designing the app, it represents every color that's possible in the app outside of the contrast mutation, so the original fundamental palette. But we ran into an issue because some elements, when they mutate, would overlap and blend in with one another, and we obviously don't want that. So the colors move toward dark, as I showed before, when the light increases. And the reason for that is that basically when you enter sunlight with a digital display, everything trends toward white, white being like the immutable color that can't get any brighter than white. So if you have black text on a white background, then that's perceived as gray text on a white background. If you have dark gray text on a light gray background, then you've got gray on gray. If you have light gray on a white background, then you have just a white field and you can't read anything. So, but if you have white text on a black background, then it becomes white on gray, etc. So having white as the text color gives you the best chance of having appropriate contrast outdoors. So we just set all the colors to turn to black, right? But we couldn't do that because that kind of ruins the point of having the palette in the first place. You're kind of establishing a visual memory of what kind of note each note is by the color that the user chooses. So we couldn't destroy that by allowing everything to go to the same color. So we compromised and tweaked the values, and that's just part of planning for mutation. And then mutation is onboarding. So this is the other thing that's demonstrated in Selene. Basically, if you are a new user to the app and you haven't created any notes and you're lingering on the screen and kind of like not creating a new note, or you appear to be struggling, then the floating action button actually transitions to a full width button that just says new note. And this is a visual transition, which is important because the user is not triggering it themselves. So we have to make it clear where that action is coming from. But of course, there's the possibility for dark patterns in this too. If we're making custom mutations outside of Gaia, then people might use it to promote a new feature or do something that's just not genuinely in the best interest of the user, if that makes sense. So I think the next step of mutative design would be figuring out some best practices before we start implementing all of these ideas. But until then, you can find the beta app at Selene, the source code, or join the community to talk more about mutative design. And by the way, I just wanted to take a close look at this slide. If you're having reservations about long-term mutations, then take a look at our first slide. So again, I'm Liam, Touchlab. You can reach me at these places. And I hope to see some more people working on mutative design. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yep. So there are no SDKs just yet, but things that are demonstrated in Selene, you can find the source code there and just look at yourself. Right now, Gaia, the kind of like platform that I mentioned, is just a class in Selene, so it just contains a whole bunch of instructions for all the elements, so you can check that out. But in the future. Sorry? So not yet. This is still, so Selene is kind of just like the second step in this. So there's an original post on Phoebe that you can read online, and then this is just like the second step, so it's still fairly new. But there is a good example that I saw in the Google Plus community that's linked up there, where someone has a button with a swipe gesture that brings up smaller buttons, and it actually uses the swipe arc of your finger to determine if you're left-handed or right-handed, and it'll show the text labels on different sides based on that. Okay. Yeah, so there's the beta is at selene.phoebe.xyz. You can join the beta there, and then the source code is up as well. And that includes all the design files and stuff too. Anyone else? right? Thank you all.